Good morning. Today we start the Apocalypse series, where different members share how God has revealed himself to each of the speakers through a work of art, a movie, a book, or a piece of music. The word apocalypse, as you heard, is deeply embedded in Adventist culture, often in a very fearful and foreboding context. It conjures up images of end-time events, war, chaos, conflict, crime, plagues, pestilence. Scary stuff. But the word apocalypse simply means revelation or a revealing. And in the proper context, this should mean a good thing, wouldn't you agree? The Apocalypse series, an annual tradition here at the Hollywood Church for the last few years, starts with a basic missional question. Where can we find God already at work in our community? Being an architect, naturally, I looked in the field of architecture. But where should I start looking? Some obvious choices would be in the many modern and brilliant works easily found today right in the middle of our City of Angels. The Disney Concert Hall by Frank Gehry, the Getty Center by Richard Meyer, the Caltrans building in downtown LA, or closer to home, the Emerson College campus right here in Hollywood by Morphosis. But I decided to go back further in time, actually where I would say God led me to my chosen career. I recall in a high school history textbook seeing the picture of what I thought was a most interesting building. And I thought to myself, if that is what architects do, then that's what I want to be. When I started college, I considered other related careers, industrial design, engineering, but eventually it became very clear to me, I do want to be an architect. And what building was that in the picture in my history textbook? Of course, Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, which is depicted in the front of your bulletin. The first time I actually saw Falling Water in person came at another critical milestone in my life. I had been out of architecture school for about 5 years, serving my required internship, and had just passed all the architect's licensing examinations. But I was burned out. I had burned the midnight oil too often and too long. I wouldn't say I had reached the top of the mountain because I hadn't, but I came pretty close enough that I could smell and knew that I could get it if I went for it. But I would have to sacrifice a bit more and commit to getting there. But I wasn't sure I wanted to. I had already sacrificed a lot to reach my goals to that point. I didn't go for fame, fortune, or power. I was too smart for that. I simply wanted to join the best firms, work with and learn from the best people in the industry, and design the most exciting projects in the city. And to a certain extent, I accomplished that. But I didn't have much left for the rest of my life. My social life was shot. My mental, physical, and spiritual life were okay, but barely. But there was a big disconnect between my work and career and the rest of my life, which included church and God. So I quit my job and accepted a job offer to teach in Michigan. Taking a big chunk of what I had intended to be a down payment on a house, instead I bought a brand new silver BMW. And a month before I was supposed to show up at my new teaching job in Michigan, I started out alone on a cross-country road trip. I was determined to see as much of the country as I could. I won't bore you with the other details of that epic road trip. But to get back to our subject, as I approached the western border of Pennsylvania, I remembered that picture in my high school history textbook. I clearly remember the noted location of that famous house, Bear Run, Pennsylvania. How many of you here have, how many of you know where Bear Run is? If you do, you're a real architecture buff, or you're lying. There is nothing there. Seriously. Bear Run is about an hour's drive outside of Pittsburgh, and there's nothing out there. No post office, no stores, no gas stations. This past summer, our family took a cross-country road trip, and I just had to show them this hidden treasure. Today, there's a visitor center run by the Falling Water Foundation. But on my first visit, all I recall were semi-paved roads with ruts and potholes, winding through forested rural Appalachia, complete with junk cars and rusting bathtubs littering the front yards of what could be best described as shacks. So how did this architectural masterpiece happen to be built here? Let's watch a short clip.
One of Wright's first apprentices had been Edgar Kaufman Jr., the son of a wealthy Pittsburgh department store owner. He hadn't stayed with architecture very long himself, but his father had become fascinated with Frank Lloyd Wright, and in 1934 asked him to design a weekend hideaway for his family next to their favorite waterfall along a little stream in western Pennsylvania called Bear Run. Wright visited the site, had the apprentices make an elaborate plot plan that showed the location of every rock and tree, and then did nothing for 3 months.
He never liked to draw until he knew what he was going to draw. And every so often we would ask, Mr. Wright, are you going to do something? And he'd say yes, and he'd walk by. All of a sudden, one day, he gets a telephone call from Mr. Kaufman.
Kaufman was in Milwaukee, just a few hours away from Taliesin.
Mr. Wright says, hello, E.J., how are you? Come along, we're waiting for you. And he hung up. Milwaukee is 140 miles, 140 minutes, and he hasn't drawn a line. Kaufman, the client, is on his way, and he sits down, and he starts to draw, and he draws a plan. And he draws the first floor plan, how it relates to everything. It's got to be a bridge so you can get across the water. The water shows just where the waterfall is. He draws the second floor plan, and he goes along and shows how the balconies are, and he says, and we'll have a bridge across so that E.J. and Lillian, that was her name, can walk out and walk from the bedrooms or from the house up and have a picnic up above. Then the top floor is Junior's room. Then he draws what we call a section through the building. That's the way you can see how all the heights are. And he's drawing and drawing, and Bob and I are feeding him pencils. He breaks them, and he puts a color on, and takes it off, and he rubs it all off, and so on. And anytime anyone walks in the drafting room, you turn around, shh, you don't wait. And people knew if Mr. Wright's working, and you don't walk through the drafting room. Then he starts to draw an elevation, a big elevation of the whole house. And the whole drawing is actually that big. Normally, we start at a scale where you draw this big, but no, he's got it going this big. And he's putting the trees, and he knows where every damn tree is, where every rock is. He gets that all done, and then his Mr. Wright's secretary comes in and says, Mr. Wright, Mr. Kaufman is here. He says, bring him in. And Mr. Wright gets up. He just stands up, and he walks toward Kaufman, and he puts out his hand, and he says, welcome, E.J. We've been waiting for you.
Wright named his building Falling Water. It would eventually become the most famous modern house in the world. And he had drawn it all in less than 3 hours.
Wright designed Falling Water to become part of nature. Trees have vertical trunks and spread out their branches. horizontally, creating a multi-layered canopy that gives shade. The building also spreads out its eaves and balconies at different levels to give shade. Rocks push their way out of the ground and cantilever over the stream and water. Likewise, the building also appears to push its way out of the ground and cantilevers over water. The streams and falls cascade down the hillside and glen. The building also cascades down the hill. Building and nature become one. Let's look at the next 1-minute clip here.
Eventually, when he designed the first scheme for the house, which was also really the last scheme for the house, he placed it, as we all know, directly above the waterfall, which I don't think had ever crossed my parents' minds. Wright seemed to have been particularly fetched by these enormous rock ledges that had broken off and allowed the water to fall, and that were such a visual feature of what remained. Because you not only saw the water falling over them, you saw the ledges extending, you saw the difference in vegetation at the bottom and vegetation on the upper level, and he saw in this a tremendous opportunity, I think, for architecture not only to work with nature, but to almost become part of nature.
As the first clip we watched shows, falling water was carefully sited and oriented to receive the sun, and the bridge and the cantilever of the water appear to emerge from the rocks. In fact, one major material used, mostly in the vertical elements, are stones quarried from the site. The horizontal elements are concrete. The other two major materials used are glass and steel, and the steel used mostly in the window frames. There were many innovations, unusual at the time. In his earlier work, Wright had already developed his signature style: long, low, overhanging eaves, corner windows, open, flowing, interlocking spaces. But at Falling Water, he took it to a whole different level. Falling Water came at a crucial time in Wright's career. He was 67 years old when he got this commission. He had had a full career, and most thought was over. Although he had a long list of completed projects, he hadn't done anything significant in over a decade before Falling Water. He was teaching and running a school that trained future architects, and most people didn't expect anything more significant from him. But Falling Water proved Wright had much more to give to the world. Let's look at another clip.
Falling Water has been called Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece of organic architecture, and I think there are a variety of reasons why. Certainly one of them is that it, perhaps better than any of his other buildings, speaks to something deep within us that longs for simplicity, unity, all of those things we find in nature and respond to so well. In 1938, when the building first took shape and publicity started to be generated around it, it appears on the cover of Time magazine. And it's very obvious that the public is captivated by the building. I don't think they'd seen anything quite like it. It was daring, it was dramatic, all of those things which capture our imagination.
Today, Falling Water is memorable, considered significant, as a great landmark in architectural design around the world. It represents a great architect working at the height of his design powers, and thus, is significant as an object in its own right. But for even people who don't think about the career of Frank Lloyd Wright or that this is a masterwork of a particular time. The building is meaningful and powerful as, again, an experience of Wright's organic architecture, of where there is a remarkable continuity of all the factors that go in the making and experience of a building. Continuities of space, continuities of materials, continuity of connection to the site, the profound sense of being somewhere. These are qualities that students of architecture today, architects, just general members of the public experience and leave the house with a sort of an awareness of the potential for good design.
A masterpiece is something that has a timelessness about it, and I think Falling Water is doing well over the test of time. People continue to be interested in it. A wide array of people are interested in it. A masterpiece is something that you continue to learn from, and we do continue to learn from Falling Water.
Falling Water is a marvelous work of genius, brilliantly integrated into nature. But there's also a very different side to Falling Water. Early on, many flaws started to emerge. Because Wright pushed the limits of materials in creating the dramatic, gravity-defying forms, cantilevers started to sag, even as early as during the construction. Some sagged up to 7 inches. What were innovative at the time, flat roofs, didn't allow for drainage, which, along with the lack of proper moisture proofing measures, resulted in multiple leaks that went into the walls. Openings and lack of insulation allowed moisture and cold into the house. While the owners of the house, the Kaufmans, loved their weekend retreat, they also had to put up with many inconveniences and annoyances. Instead of Falling Water, sometimes they would refer to it as rising mildew. Over the years, many restoration and improvements have been made to the building. Being such a significant and creative work, architects, historians, anyone who appreciates beauty, they all have decided that in spite of all its flaws, it is worth preserving and improving. With new materials and technologies not available when it was first constructed, many deficiencies have been corrected, of course at great expense. One could say the building has not only been preserved and restored, but improved upon and redeemed. What about its architect, Frank Lloyd Wright? He was and still is probably considered to be America's greatest architect. He lived until the age of 91 and had a long, varied career marked by different styles. He was actually a college dropout. He studied for 2 years in college, then dropped out, then started apprenticing for one of the pioneers in Chicago, doing high-rises in Chicago. Soon after working for Louis Sullivan, who was that high-rise architect, he left that firm to create his own practice, doing homes in the what's called the prairie style. Wright's more well-known works include, and some of these were done much later, the Guggenheim Museum, the Johnson Wax headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin, the Marin County Civic Center right here in California, and hundreds of others. Wright was so prolific, one can find his work in New York, the Midwest, where Wright was from, the Southwest, and right here in the West. Locally, right here in Hollywood, we have close to Hollywood, anyways, the Enos House right here in Los Feliz, Griffith Park, and the Hollyhock House in Barnsdall Park, right there on Hollywood and Vermont, is it? Pretty close. So he was just a prolific architect. He was a larger-than-life creative genius, But like many of his projects, including Falling Water, Wright was also deeply flawed. He lived what most would consider a scandalous life. He was always in debt. He was married 3 times. And when one of his wives wouldn't grant him a divorce, he fled to Europe with his lover. When they came back to America, one of his servants went on a murderous killing spree, killing 8 people, including his lover, some of his apprentices and students, and some other household staff. Frank Lloyd Wright was away at the time, fortunately for him, but tragically for the others. Wright was also short in stature. Some would even describe him as diminutive. His passport and biography list him as 5'8", but most who knew him guessed his actual height at 5'1" or so. Some even, I think I've read somewhere that puts his height at something even like 4'11". He seldom took pictures with others, and when he did, he was always seated or standing on a different level, so you couldn't compare his height to those around him. Although short in stature, he did have a big ego. Once, when testifying in court, he identified himself as Frank Lloyd Wright, America's greatest architect. When the judge asked, "Mr. Wright, wouldn't you say that is a bit presumptuous?" Wright replied, "Before testifying, I was sworn to tell the whole truth." There's so much more to say for which I don't have time. They're just stories upon stories. But if you're interested, there are many books and articles written. There are many film and video clips about Falling Water and Frank Lloyd Wright. Ken Burns did a great series on PBS. And in preparing for this talk, I came across a 2-part, multiple-hour interview on YouTube with Mike Wallace from when Wright was 89 years old, and he still had a very sharp mind. Besides influencing my career choice, what lessons have I learned from Falling Water and its architect, Frank Lloyd Wright? Here are a few. We too are God's masterpieces, deeply flawed as we may be. Number 2, we can go through life looking for flaws in everyone and everything, or we can treat each other as flawed masterpieces. There are also the third lesson. There are 2 postures we can take toward the world, embodied in the lyrics of 2 songs well known to Seventh-day Adventists. The first is, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through," which is the isolationist, separatist approach to the world. The other posture to take is another song which we sang earlier, and the lyrics say, "This is my Father's world. He shines in all that's fair." This is the missional, incarnational approach. Yes, this world has every kind of pain, suffering, and evil. The attack on the Charleston church just a few days ago, Ferguson, Missouri, the unending wars in the Middle East, political unrest, uncertainty in some parts of Africa, earthquakes in Nepal, graffiti and trash right here in Hollywood. We can raise our voices, shake our fists, and call others to abandon this sin-sick world. We can sing, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through," and dump as many pieces of condemning literature as we can on our way out of this soon-to-be-burned-up world. Of course, we don't think we're condemning. We're only doing this to warn others and to point out the evils of society so others can repent. But that's not how our friends in the community take our actions. While they're using their God-given talents to make this world a better, more just, more beautiful place, all they sense from us is condemnation, aloofness, and superiority. When I see works of beauty and grace like Falling Water, I cannot but take another posture toward my community. As bad as this world often seems, I am reminded this is the same world God created and declared very good. When I see creative works from artists like Wright, I sense that God's work did not end at creation, but that He still works in our midst today. What if instead of finding ways to either distance ourselves from or purify our neighbors so they are worthy of fellowship with us, we ask ourselves the question, where is God already at work in this community, and how can I join Him in that work? What if we imagined the people of Hollywood not as secular, depraved humans from whom we should flee, but as God's masterpieces, flawed as they may be, each one a reflection of God's creative power? Some would say, aren't we supposed to flee Babylon? What about the instruction to come out of her, my people? What do we do with that? Since this is the Apocalypse series, may I propose another option that may be a new revelation to some of you. It is a text that you will find in the Mission Vision tab on our church website. In a section on our website called Befriending the City, you will find our text for today, found in Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. What was that last verse again? Verse 7. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Did Jeremiah really say that about Babylon, that we should seek its peace and prosperity? Is this text a new revelation to you? If you have been a member of Hollywood for long, you would know by now this is a big part of our congregational identity and reason. And it's actually the reason we have this Apocalypse series. We are a community of God's friends befriending the city. While others may choose to flee Hollywood and proverbially come out of Babylon, even as exiles, we have chosen to be a community of God's friends befriending the city. Ours is a ministry of presence and engagement. Wouldn't this perspective be more in alignment with the attitude that compelled God to send His only begotten Son to die and redeem this world? When we look at each other as flawed masterpieces, we acknowledge a different reality. Instead of "this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through," we sing, "This is my Father's world. He still shines in all that's fair." Let's take one last look at falling water, perhaps from two different perspectives. Do you see a cold and drafty, leaky and moldy and building full of mildew and sagging cantilevers? Or do you see a once deeply flawed but restored, redeemed masterpiece? Let's meditate on this last video.